Hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting. This is the session where we're asking if a coordinated humanitarian diplomacy strategy could transform crisis response. My name's Erwin Loy. I'm a journalist with the New Humanitarian. We're a media organization that covers conflict and crises to try and inform how aid works, how it doesn't sometimes, and try to improve the understanding of people who live in crises. So next year, there are something like 300 million people who will be in need of some form of humanitarian aid. The humanitarian system will try to reach about 60% of them. That's about 189 million people. And by the end of the year, I think maybe 60% of that total will get some form of aid at all. It's not a whole lot. Now, that's a problem of money, but it's also a problem of access. In dozens of countries, there are extreme constraints on aid and access. Aid is blocked. Aid workers are on the other side of visa bureaucracy, or checkpoints, or borders. I think of Port Sudan, Yangon, Rafah border crossing. Aid workers are killed and attacked in record numbers. Local aid workers are on the front lines without adequate support. So crises are growing more complex, we all know that. Humanitarian diplomacy should play a crucial role in negotiating access, in protecting civilians, and in helping vulnerable people. But often, it's disorganized, it's fragmented, and it's not as effective as it could be. So what's a way to do it better? There's one proposal that we're talking about here today, in part, and that's a proposal from the Qatar Red Crescent Society for a global charter for humanitarian diplomacy. The charter would create clearer definitions and guidelines, improve coordination, and promote cooperation. It might better engage governments and humanitarian organizations and civil society for a common purpose. Now, just to be clear, this charter is proposed. It's not yet written. It's not yet discussed. But we're going to talk about some of that and a little bit more about humanitarian diplomacy in general. So that's just setting up what we're going to talk about today. I'll quickly go through and introduce our four panelists, then get straight to questions. Right on my left is Mr. Youssef bin Ali Al-Khatta. He's the president of the Qatar Red Crescent Society. To his left is Mr. Jagan Chapagain, who's Secretary General and CEO, I believe, of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. To his left is Mr. Pierre Kheyenbu, who is the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. And to his left is Ms. Fereya Uzfestioğlu, almost, who's the CEO of the World Humanitarian Forum. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Youssef, I'm going to turn to you straight. A simple question. Why do we need a charter for humanitarian diplomacy? What's the reason for this?
Thank you. Thank you, Erwin. I will speak in Arabic. If you allow me to speak in Arabic, I know it's Qatar. But في البداية أنا راح
I would like first and foremost to welcome everyone here in Qatar. It is my pleasure to be present here on the Doha Forum, where we are tackling such an important topic of relevance to everyone, which is humanitarian diplomacy and coordination in this respect. We in the Qatari Red Crescent always try to face these increased challenges in armed conflict, where we attempt to alleviate the suffering and pain of the people where we operate. The idea is not just limited to providing modest aid. We try to go beyond that and to reach the most needy of people. 2 days ago, there was a documentary on a TV channel on a humanitarian kitchen where the staff in that kitchen were bombarded, and those people have lost their lives. Those are people who try to cater for the needs of needy people. Those people are also suffering. We need to come up with solutions that help them and help us face such issues. This prompted us in Qatar Red Crescent Society to launch the idea of a humanitarian diplomacy charter, which could be considered as a worldwide guidelines for the work of all humanitarian and relief agencies. You are all aware of the efforts of the state of Qatar, which, thanks to its successful diplomacy, played a pivotal role in negotiations and mediations among warring parties. This led us to tap into our accumulated expertise in launching this charter, which calls for the respect of the international humanitarian law, so that it becomes the basis for this humanitarian diplomacy charter. Humanitarian diplomacy is currently fragmented. As you know, there are several efforts. However, they work in silos. There is no coordination. There is a lack of standardized means, which leads to the scattering and the dispersion of efforts. So there is an issue here. It is an issue of respect of international humanitarian law. All parties at war need to respect the international law and international humanitarian law. Also, during armed conflict, humanitarian and aid workers need to be protected as they work into providing assistance to people in need. Definitely, through this session, we will talk further about these problems, Loy.
Going to go to Pierre. I'll come back to you, Jigan. Sorry, the chairs are a little bit out of order. But Pierre, could you talk a little bit about the challenges you see from the ICRC perspective around humanitarian diplomacy today?
Thank you very much, Irvin. And it's very nice to be here, as President, also to join you and colleagues here on the panel. It's an honor to be here at the Doha Forum. The first thing that comes to mind is the organization that I represent is an organization that has for 160 years now worked in every possible armed conflict situation around the planet. We currently have colleagues in Aleppo, in Gaza, in Damascus, in Myanmar, in Colombia, and in many, many other conflicts around the world. And the first feeling that I want to express here is one of indignation at the unacceptable levels of violence that communities around the world, but in particular also in the conflicts that are currently running through the Middle East, are experiencing. There is nothing theoretical in the horrors of war. All of us follow armed conflicts on televisions, on social media. We have studied about armed conflicts in our university years, but nothing in it is theoretical. Everyday lives are shattered and torn apart. And that requires a different mobilization today. And here it requires political action, far more courage to bring about an end to the many conflicts that we see around the planet, far more courage to prevent wars from actually occurring. And I find striking today that in the world we live in, it seems like sometimes listening to political and officials that courage is described as the act of refusing to speak to the other. And I have to say that being here in Doha, I am inspired and impressed by the state of Qatar's investment in mediation. Because where we work, every day we see the human cost, the devastating human cost of the unresolved armed conflicts proliferating around the planet. and the casual way in which the world treats these armed conflicts and the suffering it inflicts on human beings. So political action is crucial to prevent and to end wars. And then in the midst of wars, the humanitarian dialogue is absolutely essential. So our colleagues right now, whether in Gaza or elsewhere on the planet, are talking to state armies, to non-state armed groups. Yes, that is at the heart of our mission. We speak to every possible non-state armed group to try and bring about better respect for civilians, for prisoners, for families separated and living the traumas of missing persons. This combination between political diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy is a necessity today. It's different roles, so states have a different role than humanitarian actors. But if I give you just one example, when exactly a year ago, over 100 hostages were released in the Gaza Strip and 250 Palestinian prisoners were released simultaneously, it required political mediation to bring that about. And again, Qatar played an important role in that. But it also required the last mile humanitarian capacities of the ICRC on the ground in Gaza and in Israel to facilitate the actual releases and bring people back to their communities. So it's this interaction which I think is a promising one. I think that's at the heart of what is proposed in the Charter, and we will certainly contribute ideas and insights to its further development. We look forward to that because it is a necessity today to bring about better solutions in the world that we live in. It is, I end with this, intolerable to see the suffering that we are currently experiencing. And if I zoom in only on what's happening in Gaza, we will be haunted for years to come by what has been happening there and what has been allowed to happen.
Thank you, Pierre. We'll talk about some of those ideas and maybe some of those challenges shortly. Jigan, I'll turn to you. I know the IFRC has done some work on I don't know if you call them policies or guidelines around humanitarian diplomacy for national societies. What can you share about how that's worked for the IFRC? What to include, what to avoid? Share your thoughts, please.
No, thank you, and thank you for Qatar Red Crescent for hosting this, taking this initiative. Maybe just to build on the two previous speakers, I just returned from Palestine. I was actually in Ramallah, and I saw Dr. Yunus here in the hall, the president of Palestinian Red Crescent. And just to build on what Pierre just said, that this is nothing theoretical. We were in Palestinian Red Crescent building, and for the 5th of December, the celebration of volunteers, we were just having a beautiful event organized by the staff and volunteers of Palestinian Red Crescent. Very touchy program with all the candles for all the volunteers that have been lost. And as soon as we finished the program and we were stepping out, Dr. Yunus received a message from Gaza saying that one more volunteer just died, or killed, not died, was killed on line of duty, paramedic was killed. So it's not only for the impact of today's complete disregard for the international norms, which is of course impacting the people who are somehow involved in the conflict, but also ordinary civilians, and increasingly this year, the humanitarian workers, the Red Cross, Red Crescent volunteers, whose only objective is to go and save somebody else's life, and in return, they are giving up their own lives. And they were on clearly marked vehicles with the Red Cross, Red Crescent logos, which are protected under the international humanitarian law, and with the marked uniform. This clearly has pushed the disregard for the international laws to a limit, and I think I fully agree with you, Pierre. I think the only word to describe is indignation. Having said that, of course, we also as an actor who are acting on the ground, we are being a membership organization, 191 countries, 16 million volunteers who are working in all of these situations. The local Red Crescent staff and volunteers are working in all of these situations, all the crises we can think of. We cannot, of course, be the silent spectators. And that's why today's event becomes so important. What do we do? What do we do about it? And there are multiple things. Of course, the part of the humanitarian diplomacy is about, of course, the setting the norms and the frameworks and the policies and the guidelines and the training. Of course, this is one part. But there is also a second part where I think, as a Red Crescent movement, particularly with the ICRC colleagues, there is also a very strong, quiet diplomacy. Diplomacy is not only done on the street, but it's also done in a quiet way. And this is something I think we got to strengthen moving forward. But a part of the humanitarian diplomacy is also that how do we continue to ensure the respect for the existing norms? If you look at it, there are very good norms existing already in the world. And if you look at the international humanitarian law or the United Nations Charter or multiple norms that exist, they're actually very, very good. If we have to create those norms now, that will be almost impossible to get to that level of the standards. The problem has been the compliance of those norms. And one of the reasons the compliance has been eroded is that the powers to be in the world somehow are okay when those norms are breached by their friends. If those norms are breached by your foes, everybody is screaming. And they should be. But if they are breached by their friends, they should also be screaming. Actually, you should be screaming more when your friends are breaking the norms, because you have a much better chance to influence your friends. But unfortunately, we have that situation here. And one of the main humanitarian diplomacy message we could get out of today's event is, can we influence the powers to be to exactly treat the breach of the international norm in the same way, be it your friend or be it your foes, and especially if it is a friend, do more so that the friends change their behavior. And if there is a consistent application, I believe we have a much better chance of a compliance.
Well, can I follow up on that with, we have representatives of the Red Crescent movement in this room and on this stage. Both of you have brought up the Gaza, and there's only so much humanitarian diplomacy can do when we're talking about the flouting of norms and targeting aid workers. So where does humanitarian diplomacy come in, and where does the politics of it come in? How do you, we're talking about humanitarian diplomacy, but is that even the right channel to confront the flouting of norms and laws? Where do you go from there?
I think that's the point I was trying to make towards the end, that there will always have to be the combination of a diplomacy, or you can call it a political diplomacy, and the humanitarian diplomacy. And there can be an interplay between the two. I think in a situation like Gaza or some of the other complex situations, and I think Pierre gave a very good example of the hostage release, where there was a political diplomacy to secure the release, and there is a humanitarian organization who actually facilitated the actual movement of the hostage. The similar principle could also apply in a complex context like Gaza, that clearly the humanitarian organizations doing their bit hasn't been successful to change the reality on the ground. Many thousands of humanitarian trucks with the humanitarian goods are now stuck on the borders trying to get into Gaza, and they cannot. And hundreds of humanitarian workers who want to provide the assistance, they are not able to do it because they don't have access or the safety or the protection. But however, what humanitarian diplomacy can do, and what we can do collectively who are here in the room, is influence the politicians to exercise the political diplomacy. And the part of the exercising the political diplomacy is to apply the humanitarian standards and the norms in a uniform manner, be it foe or be it friends. And that's where the power of humanitarian diplomacy sometimes can come directly, sometimes can come indirectly, so we can be that moral voice, moral power of influencing to the political diplomacy to take the action they are supposed to take.
Thank you, Jagan. Faraya, I will turn to you. We've talked a little bit about politics here, and it's a separate stream, but I think what's missing, I'll just ask you, what is missing from the discussions about a charter and humanitarian diplomacy in general?
Well, there are a few things that are missing. I don't think the length of the session will be enough to outline all, but I will try my best. And also, I would like to thank Doha Forum for facilitating this. Doha Forum's mission is dialogue, diplomacy, and diversity. We are creating a dialogue on humanitarian diplomacy. I believe I represent the diversity here, being out of the IFRC and ICRC system, and also in the gender balance. What is missing in the conversation is, number one, leadership. My fellow panelists mentioned about, the lack of integration between the politics and humanitarian diplomacy. So that link is definitely missing, and that needs to be integrated. This is what I can say. But in an increasingly fragmented world, we see the politicization of aid more day by day, and really we know what is wrong, and we need to start looking into how. These platforms, as the World Humanitarian Forum, we are also creating dialogue, so it is very much important. But at the same time, it has helped us to understand throughout the years what the problem is and what needs to be done. Now it's time to go into the stage of how we are going to address these things. And in regards to creating the charter, it is a great initiative, but I would say it is not enough. We need political leadership to be accountable of the actions that are being taken. So at the forum, we will be hosting World Humanitarian Summit 2.0 in 2026 with an actionable outcome of a mechanism, a pact called H20. We all know there is an eroding trust in multilateral organizations, and there is a new framework needed very much in today's world. We can't really anymore just leave 5 countries to decide the fate and future of the world. And at this point, we are taking the initiative to establish this pact, which is going to be called H20, Humanitarian 20, where we are going to engage 20 countries that are not only the biggest donors, beneficiaries, and also the countries who are going to provide technical expertise. So this is how we are going to address on our part what is missing in this whole humanitarian diplomacy dialogue, and this is what we are envisioning in integrating that political action, political will, and leadership, and at the same time hold these individuals, these leaders accountable when there is a situation that needs to be addressed. And of course, I would like to take the chance to invite ICRC and IFRC to be part of this humanitarian pact as the observers. And yes, we are in this process, and I hope this could be an answer to your question.
Thank you, Faraya. We'll look out for more info on that in 2026, I guess. I'll do another round of quick questions. Just a note that we can take some questions from the audience if there are any, so have a think. Mr. Youssef, I'll turn back to you. The charter, as we said, it's just proposed right now, but the draft version I've seen has quite a strong emphasis on making sure states are involved, making sure governments are involved. One article specifically talks about the legal role for states to lobby for humanitarian activities. Why do you see this role of states as being so important to humanitarian diplomacy, but for your charter in particular?
شكرا.
شكرا, Erwin. Thank you, Erwin. I would like to thank everyone who mentioned the issue of needing protection for people who are the most vulnerable. The involvement of governments is very important for mediation, as we spoke about the Qatar's role in mediation in the region, but also great efforts made for mediation. The government is very present in the humanitarian field. We need to engage everyone whether governments or NGOs or grassroots organizations, we need to emphasize or bring most vulnerable people to the forefront. We need to provide necessary aid to them. We want to really harness every opportunity, every actor in the field that could influence stakeholders, that could allow the entry of aids. There is no differentiation between people, no discrimination. Our pact enhances this cooperative work and finds common ground for all actors, all humanitarian associations to promote humanitarian diplomacy, promote its role as a comprehensive and harmonized group that works to create change on the ground. We immensely need this change. It provides a great opportunity for cooperation and coordination through benefiting from our experiences, developing tools to better deal with crises. We need this pact that enhances relationships between different stakeholders through coordinated humanitarian diplomacy, which gives us a bigger opportunity to work and gives more power to stakeholders to create change on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Youssef. So, I mean, I think the reasoning is that there is a need for all hands on deck to be involved in diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy. But Pierre at the ICRC, I'm wondering if there are tensions that you see from having states and governments so formally involved in a humanitarian diplomacy charter.
Thank you. I think what is clear is that interaction and different dimensions coexist. And our experience is that when that works well is when the respective roles are well understood. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So it's clear that in being able today to work in the different conflict environments that we operate in, we can only do that on the basis of an understood neutrality of the organization. You cannot operate as a humanitarian actor in a conflict zone embracing sides. The risks for your staff, the security of your personnel, the ability to cross front lines is safeguarded, is enabled by the fundamental respect of those principles. And of course, states have a different position. States will take sides at times, not always, but very often a state will take a position in a conflict environment. And so for the ICRC, in our interpretation of humanitarian work, we operate in highly politicized environments. Politics is all around us, but we do not embrace the cause of any single side. That is how we are able to be today still in Aleppo or in Afghanistan or elsewhere, because we choose not to choose a side. That is our choice. And that brings us back to the different forms of humanitarian dialogue. Much of what we do is behind closed doors. So we sit with non-state armed groups, and let me give you an example, very concrete. Our president negotiated both with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with the Hamas leadership the questions of respect for international humanitarian law in Gaza during the conflict. Now, we see the limitations, we see the violations, but it still needs somebody to go and tell the parties face to face what we are observing. And I can assure you, it also takes courage to do that. It takes courage to sit down with actors in the conflict zone and tell them what we are observing. That is done behind closed doors. Other moments are like this moment, where we do humanitarian diplomacy in multilateral settings, where we try to influence the positions of states and sometimes multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the OIC, BRICS, and many others. And then, at times, which is a little bit rare in the case of the ICRC, it can also take a form of public diplomacy. We do that less frequently because we give priority to the confidential bilateral dialogue behind closed doors. And what do we talk about, actually? Because it sounds a bit abstract. When reference is made to international humanitarian law, I'm not always sure that people know exactly what we're talking about. So these are the rules that apply to all groups that take part in a conflict. These are rules that protect civilians in times of conflict, that protect prisoners in times of conflict. And when the ICRC sits down with parties, we use that reference. And when was the fundamental development of that body of law, when those treaties were developed? In 1949, after the horrors of World War II. So when you open the pages of the Geneva Conventions that are this year 75 years old, again, there's nothing theoretical in them. Every page, every article in those conventions is anchored in the suffering that was real during World War II and World War I. And now we are many decades later, and we're seeing repeated scenes of horror. But as was mentioned by Jangan, it's not a question of reinventing the law, it's applying it in good faith, seriously. And here the mobilization, both at the level of states, so state to state, states have a responsibility enshrined in the Geneva Conventions to not only themselves respect these rules, but to ensure that other states and parties that are close to them will respect them as well. So we have many leveraging points, many points to mobilize attention. But in our experience in the ICRC, it's always based on the situations we observe on the ground, and we take that reality to then negotiate with the parties to try and achieve improvements. Many times, we are disappointed by the results. But we will go back every single time to highlight and to remind parties that the violations that they are committing are unacceptable and that they need to stop. This is how we transform what we see on the ground into the active dimensions of diplomacy. So again, related to the charter that is being put forward, I think we will make our comments and share our insights. I think it's a necessary initiative. It's welcome that we have this opportunity to debate it. And indeed, the dividing lines between the different contributions of the political world and the humanitarian world also need to be factored into this reflection, I think.
Thank you, Pierre. Jagan, I'll turn quickly to you. Pierre talked about something that the ICRC tends to be a bit more private, behind closed doors, in terms of the diplomacy that your organization does. I would say maybe you disagree, but IFRC has maybe a bit more of a public face often. National societies are involved in advocacy on certain issues, climate change, for example. I'm wondering what the line is, or if there is one, between advocacy, public advocacy, and the humanitarian diplomacy that IFRC practices.
I think it's not much different because we are part of the same family and we follow exactly the same fundamental principles. So I think the approach on the humanitarian diplomacy is basically the same. But clearly there are areas where we feel more comfortable advocating. Those are the areas not related to direct conflict. The examples you gave around the climate, for example, or during the COVID-19 time, or on the use of vaccines or not. The application of, how do you treat migrants or displaced population? That's where I think we are more public in that sense. But these are the situations where you are not taking the sides of parties to this conflict or that conflict. So clearly, these are the topics which are non-conflict related topics. We do have much more public advocacy. But when it comes to the conflict related issues, we have exactly the same principles. And actually, we take the lead from our colleagues from the ICC.
Thank you, Jagan. Faraya, I'll turn to you. You wrote before this panel to me about something you wanted to talk about, which was that aid must not be part of political negotiations. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel that's something you want to talk about?
Actually, it's not a feeling. Unfortunately, it's a fact. I heard the same thing from different ministers and different government leaders. What is happening behind the scenes, as the colleagues from IFRC and ICRC have mentioned. Unfortunately, one of the ministers in one of the recent conversations, I heard this exact sentence, that aid is now part of peace negotiations, which is something that is not acceptable. As I said earlier, now as we know this fact, this is something that we should be able to find a way to be able to overcome, because we can't really allow aid to be part of political ideas, ideologies, or anything that hinders that basic right. I think it's a criminal offense, and we should be able to really hold who are doing that accountable. And how we are going to do that is another really story that we need to discuss. And as I said, as the bottom line, aid cannot be part of peace negotiations, but we know it is happening. How we can overcome that, really, it's a big question that not only the humanitarian organizations should address, because they won't, and we won't have enough power. The people who are in power should be able to really address this problem. And we as the people have the power to be able to transform that. So sometimes it's bottom up, sometimes from up to the bottom. I think at this stage, in the current state of the world, which is very much fragmented, we need to count on the power of the individuals, the people, so that we can really achieve this transformation.
Maybe I'll come back to that quickly, but I'll just throw this out to the audience that we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. And I think I see the gentleman in the front. So while you're coming with the microphone, I'll just ask quickly to anyone on the panel. We talked about this politicization. It's no secret that it doesn't take a backroom meeting to hear these sorts of comments. Politicians link aid to soft power explicitly. So how do you, as humanitarians or humanitarian adjacent, address that in a way that's effective? And that's, with the state of the world right now, I think that's only going to increase. So I'll just throw that out there to anyone who has thoughts on that.
I think it is a reality that states make humanitarian response a part of their national political priorities and sometimes national security priorities. That is a reality of the world we live in. So there is a very serious risk at times of having humanitarian aid and humanitarian action being instrumentalized for political purposes. I think we have multiple examples of that. At the same time, as humanitarians, we recognize that we operate in circumstances that are highly political. And it is our role to carve a space for principled humanitarian action in the middle of this. This cannot just be declared. There's no such thing as a pre-existing neutral humanitarian space in a context of war. Wars are ugly businesses. It is for us to create the space through our negotiation. Now, I can go to any conflict environment and say, I am neutral. All the armed actors will say, let me observe you first before I trust you. Because it's easy to declare things, but fundamentally the trust in our principles is observed on a day-to-day basis. When we cross a front line, the person who is at the checkpoint as we go across is wondering, what information this group has seen on my side, will it carry to the other side and share there? And if I say I'm not going to share anything, it doesn't mean anything for the person at the checkpoint. When I come back from the other side and I share nothing on return, the person maybe starts to think that I also didn't share as I went across. You will be observed for many months before somebody believes that you're actually neutral. Because the basic instinct in the middle of a war zone is that people choose a side. It's not very natural to be neutral in a conflict environment. It takes a very consistent practice to be able to do that. So yes, we should encourage states to preserve that space, absolutely, and contribute to avoiding the instrumentalization, but fundamentally it is our day-to-day practice that shapes that space.
Thank you, Pierre. I think we had a question at the front here. Sir, go ahead.
Slim Slama, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the World Innovation Summit for Health. I spent also more than a decade in the region with WHO responding to emergencies. And Pierre just mentioned that carving that space for humanitarian action is key to be able to effectively address and implement the needs of the population in need. But what we see more and more, and we just published a month ago a report with WHO on the attack on healthcare, and we were witnessing this on a daily basis, is that that space has shrunk to the level that even any type of assistance has been put in jeopardy. And I think this is a challenge that we have unprecedented witnessing at the moment, is that essential services, places that we thought were sacred, like schools for Palestine, we have seen it with UNRWA and the healthcare facilities and the shelters, healthcare and healthcare workers are systematically targeted. So I understand that many of the organizations have a mandate to stay in place and work behind the scene. But what are elements of accountability when systematically the international law and the violation are happening, even for the foundation of what makes our humanity when it comes to services so essential as education and health? I think there is something that goes beyond our ability also even to protect the core of our services. At the moment, I think we have witnessing this across the globe, that the targeting of essential services like health and education require more than perhaps advocacy even on the back end. Some element maybe or litigation as well. I think the instrument for litigation. We documented with WHO since 2018 more than 7,000 attacks on healthcare worldwide. About 500 were lethal for healthcare and people working in hospitals. Not a single one have led to any litigation or follow-up on perpetrators. So I would like to hear perhaps the panel on that point.
Any comments on this?
So I can only join you on the observation of the horrific impact on healthcare workers, and Jagan and I know that well through all the network of our colleagues who are volunteers in the respective National Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies that have lost their lives. You gave an example earlier, a very important one for the Palestinian Red Crescent, and we see it in many places around the world. And I join you on your observation on the health and educational infrastructure that is there. I think there are, what is interesting in the complementarity of our voices is that we can take different angles to this topic. Some will be very public in their advocacy around these issues, and that is a necessity at times to call to attention and sometimes to call to account. Others will be more private in their outreach, and I think what we have tried over the last couple of months actually, because of these observations, because we were outraged at the levels of abuse and violations of international humanitarian law that we observe in so many contexts, was to take two sets of initiatives. One was a joint initiative in the context of the recent International Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference, where we had important resolutions adopted, by the way, by consensus, and all states were represented, and the National Red Cross and Red Crescents, the Federation and the ICRC, on compliance of international humanitarian law, and on IHL and the relation to the new technologies. Why do I highlight this? Because it was combined with an initiative that was taken by the ICRC's president to launch a senior level, high level political mobilization around international humanitarian law, launched in New York at the High Level Week at the UN General Assembly, to make sure that states take greater ownership of international humanitarian law. Because it sometimes feels to me like international humanitarian law is like a side event. You go to twice a year just to check, you reread a couple of articles, you come back, you say you've been made aware again. But it's not about reciting the articles. It's about the concrete impacts on the ground. And when IHL, international humanitarian law, is respected, it does save lives. It does. We have ample evidence of it. And it enables a better pathway to resume dialogue that can lead to a resumption of peace talks.
Pierre, I'm
So
going to
taking
interrupt you.
this seriously is really very important for us.
Thanks, Pierre. I'm going to interrupt you because we have less than a minute left, and I'm sorry we had a question at the back, but I might cut you off, and we can maybe ask that in person. But I wanted to give everyone 30 seconds just to wrap up, so maybe I could go in reverse order around what's one thing you want to leave with us? What works when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy from your point of view?
As we are short of time, I will just answer with one word. It's leadership.
Thank you, Faraya. Pierre, back to you. What works that you've seen from humanitarian diplomacy?
The refusal of indifference to people's suffering. We just cannot allow the current level of indifference and the double standards of whose suffering we react to and whose suffering we do not react to and how we categorize this. This we cannot tolerate and we must absolutely react against.
Thank you, Pierre. Jagan, what works?
For me, the really important part of the humanitarian diplomacy is we also have to lead by example. Each of us, if we are preaching the IHL for others, we also have to live by the principles of IHL. So if we want to be neutral, independent, we also have to practice that daytime, in our day-to-day time. So lead by example, and then you become credible to make a difference.
Thank you, Jagan. And Mr. Youssef, last word for you.
بالنسبة لي أنا أعتقد أن هناك
For me, I believe that we should not suffice ourselves to having laws and regulations as it is pivotal for such instruments to be implemented on the ground for the protection and safeguarding of people and civilians. It's very important for civil society organizations and governments to play a role in the implementation of those laws and regulations for the protection of a human being in general.
I apologize to the organizers, but thank you so much for attending.